I guess I'll go first. My name is Erin Degutis, and I'll turn on my video so you can see who I am. Hello from Charlotte, North Carolina. I am actually a landscape architect and planner. I work for utilities both as a consultant and embedded in-house as a full-time employee, both in the West, and I'm presently in the East and the Southeast working on transmission lines and substation siting projects. I've also experienced out in the West with the BLM on National Historic Trails and a variety of other projects. But I'd also like for Mike to introduce himself, and then I can jump over to my slides. We're a two-part presentation. On part one, Mike is part two. We kind of play off of each other.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, my name's Mike Miller. I'm a structural engineer. I'm with EXO Group, which is in Houston, Texas. And my experience, as I have about 35 years in the industry in transmission and distribution structures and foundations and systems, mainly dealing with structures. So the things that you see, that's what I deal with and have designed for many years. Working with the Department of Energy for about 20 years in the Pacific Northwest and the Columbia River watershed area. And then after that for a manufacturer, and now for a company that inspects our aging assets and aging infrastructure. So it's good to be here. And with that, back to you, Erin.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn off my video and share my screen. Okay, so today we're going to talk about BMPs for reducing visibility of electrical transmission features in pipeline corridors. I just introduced myself. Go to slide number 2. And can you see the learning objectives, or is it still showing screen 1? I apologize.
It's still on screen 1 right now on the title slide.
Okay, are you able to see my learning objectives? Or is it still on my title slide?
It's still showing the title slide right now.
Okay. Becca, this is not working. Can you go ahead and pull up my presentation?
Yep, give me just a second.
Thank you, and I apologize, everyone.
Don't worry about it, Erin. All of us have had one kind of challenge or another, so it's even if you've practiced, you think you've got it all taken care of, and not always. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Becca.
You're
Okay,
welcome.
we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, we have several learning objectives today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the perception of the landscape, both as a practitioner and professional, and what a user in the field is looking like. And there's a contrast between the two. Also, I want to give you a little bit of a primer on transmission lines and pipelines, so background information that you can use as we go into the next phase of this, where it's lines in the landscape, and transmission line and pipelines are that very much so. I also want to give you some ideas and a leg up on proactive coordination and collaboration with the utility companies, something that you can do ahead of a project being announced or in the planning phase. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies, some that I have worked on and some that are very familiar in the field, and then some techniques that you can use for minimizing contrast. And that will lead into some of the work that Mike Miller has done. Next slide, please. So one of the challenges I found as a practitioner, as a landscape architect, is how I look at the landscape. And I see it one way as a landscape architect and as a visual resource practitioner, and then as a user. And a quick contrast of that is the house I grew up in New Jersey had a 230 kV transmission tower right behind it, and the conductors were right there. So looking out into the landscape, it just was kind of a blur or a speed bump to me. I really didn't perceive it because I saw it there every single day for 20 some odd years. But when my sister and I went to sell the house, it became an issue because people would see this enormous tower in the landscape, and we didn't think it was a big deal, but for a lot of visitors to purchase the house, it was a big deal. So you have to train your eye and your sensitivity to corridors that you see and structures that you see every single day, and kind of think like you're a fresh user into the landscape, someone who's coming out onto a trail for the very first time. There's always the challenge of looking at the landscape in another eyes and perceiving it in that way. And some of the things that help you to do that is training with visual resource management through the BLM or the Forest Service, or if you've had academic training on this as well. Our overall goal is to try to reduce contrast of this infrastructure and corridors in the landscape. It's very, very difficult to do this. We can't make it disappear, so to speak, but we can reduce the contrast so it's not seen right of way, and sort of soften the edges using color, line, form, texture, and so on. Those techniques that come over from the BLM training, and you can apply it to the routing and siting of transmission lines and corridors. This is becoming more of an issue, especially now, ever since the invention of the internet. Social networking is geared up, everything from Facebook to Instagram to Reddit and so on. People are feeling very empowered about their landscapes and their lands. And there's been much more opposition to high profile projects now than in the past. So an example is Dakota Access Pipeline, obviously, some of the large transmission line corridors that are going in the Northeast and the Southeast. And then especially now with these long radial transmission lines that are going out into the landscape that are serving wind farms and solar arrays and moving this energy from very remote areas back towards the densely populated areas where there's energy demand. Next slide, please. So a couple basics on transmission lines. I mean, I could probably talk for an hour about transmission lines, the routing and the siting and so on, but here's a snapshot. So energy generation is really considered to be over 10 megawatts. Most of the resources are in rural areas, and they have to be moved to where the energy demand is, that is more densely populated in suburban areas. So transmission can be considered both transmission lines and pipelines. These are large bore pipes that carry oil, gas, VOCs to other points for distribution. High voltage transmission lines are 64 kV to 700 and above kV. That's a direct current line, so the energy is going one way. The larger the voltage, the taller the towers, the more clearance of the conductors above the earth. Pipelines greater than 12 inches are considered transmission. These are non-gathering lines, so it's moving those liquids or the gases from the point of being refined to another gate where they can be distributed. So efficient, cost-effective methods for transmission are straight corridors. Obviously, the fewer the bends, the fewer the arcs, which cost money to produce and to engineer, the cheaper it is. But unfortunately, our landscape isn't always straight lines. There's a lot of curves, arcs, horizontal, vertical, and then free-form shapes as well. So for transmission line structures, the typical span between structure to structure is 700 to 1,000 feet. However, these structures can span to 1,500 feet or more, especially if they're going from ridgeline to ridgeline spanning over a valley. The next slide, I'll show what the monopoles and the lattice looks like, but those are two typical towers. There's also a tower called an H-frame. It looks like the letter H, and it has 3 conductors on it. So keep this in mind. You can have shorter structures if you have shorter spans, taller structures, fewer spans, but they're much longer. But the common denominator between these structure spans and the heights is you must meet a minimum vertical clearance between the ground and the lowest part of the sag of the conductor. And this is a federal standard that all utilities must abide by. Just a note about undergrounding transmission lines. This is a long conversation. Typically, you can underground a transmission line for short distances, but doing it over long distances, it's very difficult for reliability. The thermal capacity increases, and then maintenance is also increased in difficulty. So, quick example, if you have an outage on an overhead transmission line, you can find the outage in hours. Whereas if it's an underground transmission line, you're talking weeks because you have to pull the conductor back through the conduit and see where the fault is. Next slide, please. And just quickly, and Mike will talk about this a little bit more. On the left is a monopole structure. It's one pole. On the right is the lattice structure. So essentially, it's a number of kits. These are also known as Texas towers fondly as well. Next slide, please. So most pipelines are underground. Obviously, the exception is the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, but that's a very specific case. So with pipelines, when it goes through the landscape, there are 2 things you need to keep in mind. There's the construction easement and the permanent easement. So the construction easement will be temporary. It's between 25 and 50 feet, immediately adjacent to where the permanent easement is. That's where the pipe is. So the construction easement is just temporary. It can go back and be revegetated. However, it is typically cleared all the way to the ground during the construction process. The one unique thing about pipelines is you can do a horizontal directional drill, and you can go under river, lakes, wetlands, streams, and so on, so you don't disturb the land next to those sensitive features. The only exception is if you encounter areas of rock or unsuitable geotech, you may not be able to do HDD. You may have to do an open pit or open cut to place the pipe into the ground. You can do arcs and bends in pipelines. This does encumber planning and engineering ahead in order to make those arcs work. We're not going to talk about pipeline support infrastructure because that is, a different totally topic, but that includes compressor stations, metering equipment, and pig launchers. These are essentially structures or tanks that are in the vicinity of where a pipe comes up, and the pressure needs to be maintained or maintenance needs to be done. Next slide, please. And here's 2 quick examples of pipelines in the landscape. The images on the left are in Thomasville, North Carolina. That's about an hour and a half north of Charlotte. You can kind of see the faint scar of the landscape going from the upper right to the lower left. That is the pipeline corridor. And then the viewpoint is at the road, and you're looking to the northeast. So you can kind of see where it is very clear through the landscape. If you were to go onto Google Earth and zoom out, you would see this line all the way across the landscape. On the right is another pipeline that's near Opal, Wyoming. Opal is actually a pipeline hub for a number of different companies. So if you were to go to this area on Google Earth, you would see a number of pipeline scars coming into this area. The difference with this scar is you can see it on the aerial, but if you go to the ground view, because of the landscape plant material in the area, it has revegetated over and kind of assimilated into the landscape. However, this is a combination of annual and perennial grasses and a little bit of sagebrush. The thing about sagebrush is a low growing shrub, and it takes a very long time for it to grow back. So in certain areas, you will see a distinct scar across the landscape, like you can see to the right-hand side of where the viewpoint is. That goes across an area where there's taller sagebrush and it hasn't grown back yet. So next slide, please. So here we're talking about lines in the landscape. So I wanted to show you this cross section of a transmission line. And this kind of goes back to our transmission line basics. So we have the wire zone where it is totally clear of vegetation, the border zone, which is next to the conductor where trees are generally removed taller than 10 feet. This is also known of an area that a utility can claim as danger tree rights, where they can remove trees that are a potential hazard to the conductor. That is, a branch can come down or the whole entire tree can come down and take the conductor down and cause an outage or a fire. And then you have the outer zone where you have your regular vegetation too. So this graphic is typical for what utilities have. I pulled this from a utility other than the ones I've worked for, just to kind of show variety. But these lines in the landscape, create these long corridors. They fragment the landscape and habitat. They remove a lot of that side transition or old-field transition that you normally see, like against the edge of fields or near a river and so on and so forth. These corridors have to be regularly maintained for reliability purposes. And then this goes back to the NERC reliability standard for vegetation clearing. And this is done so that these, the limbs and the trunks don't come in contact with overhead conductors. With pipelines, they maintain vegetation clearing so you don't have trees growing in the corridor and impacting pipelines. So even though there's a lot of vegetation clearing, there are areas of opportunity, and this is to recreate the successional zone along the border, and even thinking about creating annual and perennial bands as well for pollinator habitat, which some utilities are taking up with right now. So you can soften the edge by creating these, getting creative with the border zones. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to transition over to proactivity. So in my position working with utilities and also as a utility employee, I do a lot of public engagement and public involvement with projects, both with substation and transmission line corridors. Communication is very key between both parties, so they're both aware of what's going on with the projects. And utilities are starting to step up now and encourage more public engagement and outreach with their communities with their different projects. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. You can work directly with the utility or the pipeline operator or their professional organization like the Southern Gas Association. You can also go to your Public Utility Commission for electric transmission lines. Or if there's a FERC pipeline or electric transmission line, you can work with them as well. Public utility commissions are always interested in how the utilities are doing and especially interacting with the public. They do generally have a designated liaison or public office of the public staff so that you can call and talk to them about your concerns of a transmission line and so on. The utilities themselves, the way you can interact with them is through the community area manager or district manager and the siting and land rights staff. So myself, I've been a member of siting and land rights staff in working with the community. The community area managers are designated for specific areas or communities within the service territory as well. With pipelines, you've got their government relations staff and or their outreach staff. Another way you can interact them during a project is through public open house meetings. Typically, they are in person. We're starting to get back to that a little bit, but we're starting to have this hybrid model where we're having some virtual open house meetings as well as some limited in-person contact. So the Public Utilities Commission and NEPA require public engagement for the most part. This includes the study area meetings and alternative corridor meetings. So you've got a couple of different ways to interact and talk to staff about your concerns about the visual landscape and impacts from these projects on the visual landscape. So next slide, please. So here's a couple of key ways you can interact with them. You know, you can have field meetings with the utility staff directly, and you can identify the issues or concerns that you have, like the key observation points or other sensitive resources. And I gave a couple of examples here. If a project is in flight and you've received a notice that there is a study area or a corridor going on, strongly encourage that you fill out that comment form and you submit it to project staff. These are all read and reviewed by project staff. They become a part of the public record for the project, and this includes even if it is regulated by the Public Utilities Commission versus NEPA. So when you do comment, you know, please say something more than, I really hate this project. I wish I had $1 every time I read that comment and I would be a millionaire, but right now. But you need to give a substantial comment and say, you know, I don't like this project because, or this project could adversely impact the views from this historic point and so on. Give them something to work on as well. I strongly encourage that you request a follow-up meeting with the utility or the proponent staff to discuss this. Generally, utility staff will encourage this, especially if you can come out onto property and see exactly in person where the issue is. It's interesting that you can describe it to the best of your ability, but when you get staff out there and you can say, point them in the direction and say, this is what my concern is, boots on the ground tremendously help a lot and help to get your concern addressed. You can also follow up with the Utility Commission and or FERC if it is a project at that level. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to go to a couple of case studies here. And John McCarty may have mentioned this project early on in his presentation. So this is a high voltage transmission line project. It's in the high country of Colorado in the Rocky Mountains. It was initially planned, designed, and constructed in the early to mid 1970s. I believe it went in service in mid 1970, 1975, or 1976. This transmission line corridor is about 800 to 900 feet south of Interstate 70. If you've gone to the Copper Mountain ski area and you're driving west on I-70, this line will be on your left. It is located in the White River National Forest. So as part of the planning of this project, Xcel Energy had to coordinate with the forest on where this corridor was going to go as part of getting a permit for the right-of-way grant. So these are steel monopoles. They are painted green. I know that they have been painted only once prior to installation. They have not been painted since then, to the best of my knowledge. The unique thing about this color green, it blends in pretty well with the mix of conifers and rock that are behind it. So if we go to the next slide, we can see on the top image, the white line represents the corridor, and you can kind of see I-70 snaking around. And then Copper Mountain Ski Area is on the lower right. And then you can see where the viewpoint is. And then I've had to use leader lines to identify where those structures are. For the most part, they're hard to see. They blend in pretty well, and especially if you're driving at a high speed. This section of I-70 is about 75 or 80, but folks tend to drive a little bit quicker through here. So you go by and there's not a lot of contrast. So even though you have a green pole against gray rock, there's low contrast right there versus some other areas along I-70 where, you know, the poles are not treated and they're galvanized steel and they kind of stick out and have a lot of contrast in the landscape. So next slide, please. Okay, this next project is something I worked on when I was at Xcel Energy. As part of Xcel's, you know, upgrading and hardening of their infrastructure, they looked at creating additional 345 kV transmission lines in southeastern New Mexico to serve the mining and oil and gas industry. So the lines are partially on private land, some are on BLM lands. This specific line was mostly on BLM lands. In southeastern New Mexico, there's low visual quality. It's fairly flat, nearly featureless, a couple of shades of gray. We're talking maybe a visual resource class of maybe 1 or 2. The challenge of this area, there was a lot of karst topography that created siting challenges of where you were going to place structures because you did not want them to fail. So in this area was a feature called Livingston Ridge. It's classified as a VRM3. It was as tall as an 11-story building. It had a lot of color to it. It had reds and oranges as well as beiges. It was actually quite a pretty feature to look at. So Xcel Energy, their consultants, and the BLM Visual Resource staff, we worked together to reroute the line away from Livingston Ridge. So we went out there and identified the KOPs. We did the visual resource analysis. We looked at each of the points and we developed different corridor alternatives. And then we worked with the BLM and got their concurrence on the corridor option. So if you go to the next slide, the yellow line represents the initial candidate route. The white circle is Livingston Ridge, and you can kind of see how the colors differentiate from the rest of the landscape. And then you can see where the white leader lines are. That's where the existing line is today. So instead of going from a straight line, you know, skimming the edge of that white circle, it deviated to the south away from Livingston Ridge and then again to the southeast. So we were able to avoid this visual feature in the landscape. And just for trivial purposes, the structures that were used here were Corten, or the dark brown weathered steel H-frame structures. So they were able to stay a bit lower in the landscape versus a monopole, which would tend to be taller. So next slide, please. I also worked on this project. This was in the Pacific Northwest. So this was for a new natural gas pipeline project. It was not built eventually, but a lot of the studies went into it to route it from one side of Oregon to another. It was in Southern Oregon, so it avoided California and CEQA. But this potential line corridor crossed a national forest, a scenic drive, a wild and scenic river, and the Pacific Crest Trail. So I don't know how many other visual resources you can cross in one segment of pipeline corridor, but it did. But essentially, it was a fairly straight corridor with a 50-foot permanent easement. And I worked with an ecologist, a wetland scientist, and also a visual resource specialist in ways to reduce contrast in the landscape and to borrow from natural features. So if you look on the left, that is a sample of what the forest looks like. On the right is a section of the Pacific Crest Trail, and you see a person standing there. That's actually my sister. She's 5 feet tall, so that gives you some pretty good scale right there. So next slide, please. So we came up with a palette of management techniques. So we were proposing to narrow the pipeline right away within 75 feet of the trail crossing. And we borrowed from a feature in the landscape called a wind throw. So wind throw is when a gust of wind comes down and it knocks down a group of trees. It is generally an irregular shape, sometimes fan shaped. So that's what we borrowed from. So we mimicked a natural event that happened in the landscape. So you can narrow down pipeline clearing, but only for short segments. So we were able to do that. We also looked at crossing roads and trails at a 90-degree angle to reduce the visual impact as possible. We also wanted to suggest preserving some of the upper branches of trees by tying them back versus trimming them off. We also recommended that the material from the trees that were removed, such as snags, branches, and so on, were kept on the edge of the right-of-way and used as nest trees or future trees. And we also would stockpile these removed trees and branches and scatter them over the right-of-way to simulate down trees. So we kept those sections of logs and branches and kind of recommended that they come down randomly, not in a straight line, not piled up. So it looked like there may have been just a tree removal in the area and so on. Just anything to try to dampen and soften the edges of that pipeline corridor. We were also lucky in that we found some native plant materials, some large rhododendron shrubs, and to replant them in aggregate drifts near the edges of the pipeline right away, just to kind of soften that and direct the view down the trail versus looking either side onto that pipeline corridor. We also recommended that revegetation efforts be concentrated near the roads, the trails, and the rivers to try and soften that up a bit. We also recommended that thinning and removing tree branches to open up views to other areas outside of the pipeline corridors, and this directs your eye in the view away from the area that's been opened up for that pipeline corridor. So this is just some of the techniques that we recommended to the pipeline operator and in a document that went to the Forest Service as far as how we were going to soften and reduce contrast in the landscape from this swath that crossed it. So next slide, please. So with transmission lines, it's a little bit trickier. It's very hard to hide something that's that tall in the landscape. And in the image there, I've tried to clip out the best I could. This is, again, the Xcel Energy line along I-70. And this is an example of the green pole, and it's skylined a little bit, but they had to build the structure that tall in order to get the clearance over the existing vegetation in the ground and also maintain off over I-70. So in the routing and the siting process, which is something I work on actually daily for a couple of years, visual resources are considered. And if there's a valuable visual resource, such as a scenic view or a resource, a cultural landscape, or something that's on the National Register, we can increase the weighting for the sensitivity of where that is. We also identify observation points and sensitive resources in this process very, very early on in the planning process. To the extent of our ability, we try to avoid skylining of the transmission lines, which is what you see on the image to the right. We also look at potentially co-locating the transmission line with other corridors to reduce new corridors or greenfields across the landscape. I just recently did this in a project in North Carolina, where the line engineers wanted to go from point A to point B and just zip across the landscape. And there was a distribution corridor that was already there. And we ended up reciting that corridor, proposed corridor, to next to the distribution line so that you only have a minimal impact across the landscape. So we did have to widen it a bit to accommodate the transmission line, but we were creating a new line across the landscape. So with my line engineering colleagues, they are the ones that may drive some of the structure selection due to span length and span clearances. So that includes the monopole versus lattice towers, the material selection for the structure, which could be steel, concrete, or fiberglass. Most utilities are getting away from wood because they're looking to have materials that will last longer, and also a material selection of the conductor. So a non-specular conductor versus another type of treatment. Next slide, please. So here we go a little bit more with the different techniques to reducing that. Also with vegetation management, you want to try to create those softer transitions at the corridor edges, and looking at revegetation treatments with annuals and perennials, or even hydroseeding and hand plantings. You could consider narrow corridors in selected areas, simulate those wind throws and patch dynamics of ecology in the landscape, but you still need to take into consideration safety measures, asset protection, and the NERC safety standards. Next slide, please. And that's what I have for questions. Apologies for the hiccups early on. I'd be happy to address them, or if we'd like to transition over to Mike, I can do that as well.
How about if we go on to Mike, and then if there are any questions, people can put them in the chat box and we'll try and do them at the end.
Thank you.